after the war, when I came down here to be the chief maintenance engineer for the DC-3s at NAC. The Aero Club at that time were just being allocated aircraft that Airwork were designated to take on the engineering. And John Neve was elected to be the chief flying instructor. But coming up to that, an ad in the Star and the press too, that a meeting was going to be held in the provincial buildings in Oxford Terrace, which did eventuate and which I did attend. And there would be at least 30 men turned up, and it was decided to form a committee to start the Aero Club rolling again. And I was elected, much to my astonishment, because I think I was only an airman. Most of these other chaps were officers and flying and had histories and that. But never mind, I was elected to go on the committee. That would be in about 1946. Of the aircraft that the club came up with, well, first of all was the great Tiger Moth, which is my favourite aircraft, and they tried to bring back aircraft that were put into service in units around New Zealand that weren't Air Force material, but they were used for communication and that at the beginning of the war. And the Canterbury Club had a Whitney Strait, and that came into our under the wing of the Canterbury Club again, and the Tiger Moths were allocated. I think were allocated 3, and it was very well done. It was going to be about an even pay back, as it were, to what they put in when the war broke out. And so Airwork did the aircraft engineering, John Neve doing the flying, and there were some very keen chaps that had been flying during the war, kept up their flying, and it was, I had to get my licence renewed because it had lapsed over the 6 years, which I did do, and then we started off with having a competition once a month, just on bombing and landing, and there was at Hayward here, we had the old hangar had been taken from Wigram and re-established, and they gave us that, and we liaised with, I think it was a chap Hudson, came in just before Ivan Jamison, and we came to an agreement on the space on number 3 hangar. I had a good job over at NAC, and I was quite happy there till things at Palmerston North, where Union Airways were headquarters before the war, were the chaps that had come back from the war. War went back there, and they wanted to make Palmerston North still the headquarters. John Neve, who was the chief test pilot for de Havilland, that's where I worked before I came down to Christchurch. He somehow got in touch with me if I was interested in coming down here. So I said to John, I think it might be a good time for me to make a move and go over and go back to the job I love, put on overalls instead of a uniform. So it was advertised in the papers and that, and I put in for the job, and after about 4 years with NAC, I left there and came over and set up the engineering shop in number 3 hangar there. The aircraft were hangar there. There was no workshops, no tools, but there was always sales of rehab tools and things of aircraft. But Morrie Council came over. We were both Southland Aero Club engineers before the war, which was great. We were allocated other aircraft, and one was the Dragonfly, and we weren't going too well. There were the main downfall of the situation was that not a lot of us had a lot of money to spend on flying. And I can remember after about 6 months when of being at the Aero Club, I had managed to accumulate quite a lot of spares from Wigram, and the chap that was the spares officer here, and I also went up to some sales up at Wellington where there were a lot of spares, and I think I was given about half a dozen motors and enough parts to make 2 or 3 Tiger Moths, but we had to get trestles and spray guns, and we had to get a paint shop, and I bought a lathe. But we got there and we enjoyed it very much. But we weren't doing enough flying, so we decided to do something. I forget what the main thing was. I think we had an air pageant, and it went very, very well. We had the old Austin out in the paddock with the drunk pilot, and they sort of did things with them. Parachute jump, which was quite entertaining, and we had some very good pilots. Monty Harvey was a chief flying instructor at Hatfield in England during the war, and he would be the best Tiger Moth pilot I've ever seen doing aerobatics, and it was quite hard to believe. I wasn't an aerobatic person, but I loved flying a Tiger. But Monty Harvey he put on a terrific display of aerobatics, and things picked up after that set up, and it was an era when whooping cough was very prominent, and we used to get quite a lot of work from the hospital with infants that had whooping cough, and John used to put on his gabardine coat and a scarf, and they'd go up to us, I forget what height they'd go up to, about 8,000 feet, and fly around for about half an hour to help their respiratory set up, and that was a very good income from, instead of just commercial flying. Although I had built and installed a stretcher, and we'd used the Dragonfly for taking medical cases down to the Dunedin Hospital, and that was, but it slowly built up into those commercial flying parts, sort of supplemented the chaps that were learning to fly. But then another generation of youths came along that wanted to learn to fly, and that's where Peter Grundy and Bill Antle came to the club, and there was a setup where there was some reserve flying, and I think Peter and those boys were in this sort of a civil reserve.
The guys that were there when I joined was John Eve, Les Page and Ivan Gunderson. And John was a really interesting fellow. He started off with Bert Mercer, and he was the chief test pilot for de Havilland during the war, based at Rongotai. And I recall once he told me that he'd had 9 engine failures with the Gypsy Major engine, and some of those were out of Rongotai, and he never scratched an aeroplane. He got it back on the ground each time. And he flew the DH-86, the 4-engine Domini. He flew Dominis, and he flew every Tiger Moth that was ever imported into New Zealand. So he had, quite a history. And Les was he'd just come to the Canterbury Area Club from Air Traffic Control, and he was a pilot during the war under the Empire Training Scheme. He went to Canada and learned to fly there, and when he came back he joined ATC, and then he joined Canterbury Aero Club as an instructor. And then the third one in the seniority list was Ivan Gunderson, and Ivan flew Beaufighters during the war. I met Ivan quite a lot after that, after I learnt to fly at the club when I was in the Air Force, because he used to come into Wigram at Central Flying School for flying instructor refreshers in the Air Force. When John retired, a chap called Stan Dodwell came in, and he went top dressing, and he flew Lancasters. So, you know, they're all pretty interesting guys. When I joined my era, the students were myself, Jim Pavitt, who was a pilot with NAC, Brian Antle, and John Evans, Bill Ensor, and we all got an Air Training Corps flying scholarship via school, which gave us 30 hours free flying in a Tiger Moth, which was absolutely magnificent. If it hadn't been for that, I don't think I couldn't have afforded to fly, and I don't think I'd have had a career in aviation, so I was lucky enough to get the scholarship.
I was on the last aircrew course, RNZAF, during the war, course 66, Tyree, and went solo on a Tiger. And just after that, the war finished and we all went home. 1953 was the air race. That's the London Christchurch air race. All those Canberras and Viscounts and DC6s and what have you. And that's really what sparked me off back to flying. And I see my logbook says November 53 I started flying again. Ostas, BBZ, BBT, BCK, BCQ. Bay Ellison sent me solo again. He was a part-timer. The full-timers were John Neer, of course, in charge, Ivan Gunderson, and Stan Dodwell. We operated the end of the hangar, right alongside the Teal, as it was in those days, Tasman Empire Airways Limited. The DC6s used to park alongside, and we flew out of the what was called the Western Grass. And of course we landed into wind in those days. There wasn't much runway flying done, not with Tiger Moths. We had a Tiger, and I converted onto the Tiger. The Magister, two Magisters, that's ATD and ATE. And the Messenger, ATT. The Tiger, incidentally, was ATF. And once I instructed at a later stage, remember the airline, NAC, did not fly on Sundays. So, interwind was quite normal. I got my commercial. When was that? In 55. And joined Harry Wigley down there at Mount Cook. A couple of years later, 57, I see my logbook says February 57, John Neve decided to call it a day. I don't really know why, except that he was very interested in radio, so he left flying to devote more time to his radio interests, I think. The call came down to me at the Fox Glacier at the time, that there was a job going at the club, and they wanted me, so I said, rightio, coming. I didn't have an instructor's rating, but that was the first thing on the agenda, become an instructor. So about 2 to 3 weeks later, I went to Wellington and got my instructor's rating and straight into it. By then, of course, Stan Dodwell had gone, and there was really only Ivan Gunderson and myself, and we were helped out at weekends by the Air Force blokes at Wigram. They would come over and help us out Saturdays and Sundays, mainly Sundays. Now that's Mayne Hawkins and Peter Grundy, Lindsay Caldwell, Gordon Vetty, just to name a couple or two. The club had expanded to Cubs by then. I see B&L was being used, B&M. We'd obviously got rid of the tiger moths. Because when I was learning to fly, I was glider towing. The gliding club were here as well, so we did gliding towing as well. Certainly the Messenger had gone by then, so there were just the Osters and the Magisters and the Cubs. Also, while I was here, well, when I started off, people just turned up at the club, and they might have to sit around a bit, waiting for a flight. It was really very piecemeal, nothing organised whatsoever. I managed to start off sort of a booking system. It didn't work that well, but it at least was the start of what we now have, where you can just book in now. Well, we made a start on that process, and it managed to even things out a bit. People had a bit of an idea when they came out that they'd actually get a fly within a reasonable time. It made a great deal of sense. But of significance is that one day Pat Scotter, he must have been president by then, he nailed me and said, we want a ground instructor, Elgar, to do some PP lectures. And I said, okay, Pat. And that saw me for a good 10 or 15 years doing that, once a week. And many of the old members will remember me in that role more than the actual flying role, because my flying role really was quite short. It was only 4 years.
Yes, the formative influences of the Aero Club were enormous on me as a young person, because I was here when I was a school kid, and one does tend to role model on people who've had a positive influence in their life, and there have been a number of those. I said Laurie Council was one of them. There have been a number of those people in the club, and from that point of view, the club's been a great stabilisation to me, and I've got to be very, very thankful for the Aero Club in so many ways. Certainly people who want to make flying a career have got to really want to do it. I learned to fly in an Oster, the old British aeroplane, which was the machine that the club bought after the Tiger Moths. Like the Tiger Moth, no electrical system, no radios, communication with the control tower via flashing lights, one way only. And I flew a Piper Cub after that, and that was an enormous leap forward because it had a radio with valves and that sort of thing. Ivan Gunderson was the chief instructor, who was an ex-wartime pilot. The chief engineer was a chap called Laurie Council, who was an exemplary human being, a wonderful man who had a very positive effect on me as a young person. We didn't really have a manager as such in those days. There was a paid secretary. They were really just moving into the modern American aeroplanes. Up till then, like the rest of New Zealand, we'd been buying British because we had to. The Tiger Moths were pretty much phased out. The Osters replaced them, the British Osters, which had the same engine as the Tiger Moth, and they were very much like a Tiger Moth in many ways, not many refinements. I remember the first aeroplane that I saw that actually had a cigarette lighter in it, and that was a Piper Tripacer, and that was a wonderful machine with a spangly interior and soundproofing and a radio, and it had a cigarette lighter, and that was pretty special. There were other machines such as the Cubs. The club also had a Piper Comanche, which was tragically lost in an accident in Auckland, and that was for a very early machine, but it was really too much for the pilots at the time, I believe.
I first became interested in flying as a high school lad at Ashburton, and on Saturday mornings I would earn some money pricking out pine trees, I think it was, for a nurseryman. And on Saturday afternoon I'd take the money that I'd earned to the Ashburton airfield and cadge a ride with somebody. So when I left school and went to Teachers College, I joined the Canterbury Aero Club, and all our training was done in Osters, J5F, the Aglet. We had 3 of them, BCK, BCQ and BBZ, and I think I went solo after about 12 or 15 hours. I wasn't very quick at going solo. Ivan Gunderson, one of our instructors at the time, sent me off solo, and that was just the greatest experience of the lot. And from the Oster, shortly afterwards, we got one of these machines, and they were the best things since sliced bread because they had an electric starter and a heater in them, and that was a huge step forward. And the young instructors of today wouldn't believe me if I said that we did all our night flying in Piper Cubs, and I did 10 hours night flying and working towards my commercial pilot's licence, which I never obtained, but did 10 hours flying here at Harewood in a Piper Cub. How they instructed in this machine I'll never know, because there was no intercom. It was just shouting with the instructor in the back and the student in the front. So that was Osters, Piper Cubs, a Piper Tripacer, and they were a delightful machine, our first tricycle undercarriaged aircraft, and they had radios and a cigarette lighter. And interestingly enough, the aileron and the rudder was interconnected, so that when you rolled into a turn, the appropriate amount of rudder went in at the same time.
I joined the club in about March 1960.
first lesson would have been about a month later in April, and that was with the then CFI, Ivan Gunderson, and the current piper cupboard still at the club, B&L. So as I say, I started to learn in the early 60s. I've done right through the PPL and CPL on piper cubs, and if memory serves me correct, I think I went solo on B&L, done my PPL and B&L. Don't think my commercial was done in that, but I know my CCAP instructor rating was issued at B&L. The other aircraft types around the club at the time, Tripaces, J5F Osters. The club had a PA-23 Apache for a few years in the early 60s. Elgar Dixon sent me solo out here in 02 on the Western Grass. I think it was after about 7 hours training. That was in B&L, as I mentioned before. The CFI in those days was Ivan Gunderson. And then I just worked on through to get a commercial, which I think I got about August 1964, and then went straight on for an instructor rating and started working at the club full time, I think probably about November 1964. Norman Gibson was the operations manager at the time. Brian Antle came back to the club about then as chief instructor. And Norman made me sort of the North Canterbury instructor. In those days I would spend Saturday afternoons and Sundays at Rangiora. Mondays I'd be in Kaikoura. Tuesdays I'd be at Christchurch. Wednesday, Thursday days off, and Fridays Culverton, and then back in Christchurch just for Saturday morning.
There was a lot of interest in Rangiora to get an airfield, and there was Bay Ellison and myself, and I think Graham Davidson might have been with us, and we met the Business Association people out on the, I forget what they called the land. It was Crown land next to, it was all heavy stones and very undulating and that, but it wasn't being used for anything. And we walked all over it, and these businessmen association were keen to get it going, and Ray Hassel would have been one of the head men there, and Ray, and there was the chap Van Ash, there was an accountant. It was good. The chaps were really interested. The only drawback they had, but the mayor, who was an undertaker, wasn't interested, and that was a bit of a drawback. So they never invited him to any of the meetings. But we got organised, and it was agreed that we could use the land. It was Crown land, that's what it was, catchment board, to make a runway. And one of the chaps, we paid for the fuel, and he did the running out, and then we used to have sessions of picking up the gravel stones and that on there, and we had a runway, and I had a lot of fun going, I put in a lot of time going over there to get the thing going, and then we reckoned that we should, to raise money to build a clubhouse. We had a rodeo, and the person that I thanked and should still thank, and he's still around, was the chap from Hanmer, and he brought down a truckload of cattle. I don't know whether they were quite big to me. I'm not a farm person, but and some wild horses, and I was that. I stood on a flat deck trailer all day. I wasn't getting down off, and they had these steers, and we So we must have been able to land there. But
the development of Rangiora Airfield itself, I know they used to have a radio over there as a fundraising thing. If memory serves me correct, it was around about Labour weekend, because they also would have a pageant over there at Labour weekend as a fundraiser for the Rangiora Airfield. And I know the first ever lesson that I had with Ivan Gunderson and BNL, we landed it.
I was a kid when Rangiora was being built, and I used to get press ganged into going and standing at the gate of the airfield and selling admission to idiots who used to turn up and pay to come and watch horse rodeos, which were turned on by people, organised by people like Bill Ensor, to raise money for the clubhouse and for the airport development. And those are my earliest recollections of Rangiora.
There was a school of thought, and I think it was the president and the ops manager at the time had ideas of a satellite field being built down somewhere near the estuary. And Brian Antler came up with the site at West Melton, be it one block closer to Christchurch than where it actually did end up being.
West Melton became a suitable option. It was not really viable farming land, but it was ideal for our purposes, and we were able to secure a long-term lease and to develop West Melton Airfield there, along with long-term planning agreement from Civil Aviation, whoever they were then, that the club would be able to operate from there without becoming unduly restricted by traffic here at Christchurch Airport. So all the airspace development was had West Melton in mind, really from at the time, which was about 69 or so, planned and put West Melton together, which was really just a bare airfield with 3 grass runways, one of them also including a tarmac strip. And we didn't have any facilities there other than a little chalet somewhere to house a telephone for many years. But the actual airfield itself was a very useful development.
As West Melton came later, of course, Bill Morrison had an enormous importance to West Melton, but I can certainly remember the work that went into forming the runways and that sort of thing. There was a very, very complete survey job done by the engineering concern who did West Melton. They did cross-sectional drawings of the whole runway area and calculated where the material had to be taken from and where it had to go to before they even started. I remember being advised by the agricultural contractor at the time that if it grew, let it grow. For goodness sake, don't try and stop anything growing at West Melton. Be grateful for what you can get. And so, we bought a little chalet which was there for some years. Never a complete success, but when I say we bought it, my wife bought it at a Christchurch AMP show because the people who had it on display didn't want to take it away, and she went and made an outrageously low offer for it, and the club bought it without ever knowing they'd bought it. But that's well gone now.
Well, I first arrived on the scene here in end of 65, 66, and I joined the club in February in 1966. I come from the UK at that stage. I had a PPL and flew Osters mainly, and I'd been flying gliders and I'd been working in the aircraft industry in the UK. And I did my training for my commercial licence, which I completed in 66, in about December 1966. Pretty well straight away I started training for my instructor rating, and I did my C category instructor rating in February or March of 67, and started working for the club as a staff instructor straight away. There's a lot of training going on in the 60s. In those days, the operations were based in the side of the hangar, the old council hangar, which is no more now, of course. we had a little briefing room and a general working area, office I suppose, and picket fence outside on the air side where on nice days we used to sit outside and drink tea and watch aeroplanes just on the tarmac. And the current security restrictions these days really make it look very quaint, but that's how it was. Did my B category instructor rating in about 3 months. Well, it was in July, beginning of July in '67, which was really a basic qualification as a working instructor. In the council hangar, the Aero Club, we had one end of the hangar, about a third of it, which was fenced off, and the other end was the public hangar. In about '67 or so, the public end was taken over by Mount Cook Airlines, and some small residual space was available for light aeroplanes, and they needed extra access, so the airport or the council built a new hangar door in the side of the hangar, which was really in the middle of the club's operating area. And we were able to persuade them to build us some briefing rooms and a tea room and so on above that, so we had an elevated, improved facilities, which was really quite good, while our operation was based on the side of the hangar then. That was about then, '67 or '68, I can't remember exactly. The social facilities were in the old clubhouse, which had been brought over here from Wigram, wartime, and that clubhouse was still standing. In about '68, we built a new clubhouse, really because I think the airport wanted to demolish that and use the space for roading and so on. Anyway, we were able to build new club rooms on just past the north end of the hangar, and for some years that was just purely a social facility. In those days the club had a Mid-Canterbury branch at Ashburton, where we operated weekends and Wednesdays, and we took it in turns on a sort of 3-month cycle to run the Ashburton operation. And I remember I started doing that in '67 and was the Ashburton instructor for some while then. One development which I was involved with was from about '67 onwards we had a regular contract for training air traffic control cadets. In those days the cadet scheme for air traffic controllers involved their doing a 60-hour flying course, which we ran. We did more than just a basic PPL for them. They did some aerobatics, some instrument flying, so they were reasonably well-rounded pilots by the time they'd finished. And I was involved in all of those. I think we ran 15 courses, and they were normally 12 per course. And from the start we based those in the new clubhouse, which really, I suppose, dates the clubhouse, which must have been built in '67, because I'm sure that's when those cadet courses started. I was always quite keen on doing aerobatic instruction. When I started with the club, we still use Osters. We had a J5F Oster still. BCQ, I think, was the last one we had for doing aerobatics. That was replaced quite shortly afterwards, in about 1966, '67, with a Champion Citabria. While it served as an aerobatic aeroplane, it was not a total success. It seemed to keep on getting blown over or tipped over. It spent quite a lot of its time with us, having its wings rebuilt after spending time on its back. And then we had the first Air Tourer, 150 horsepower Super Air Tourer with a constant speed propeller as an aerobatic aeroplane for a while, which was quite good really. But we didn't persist with that because the Beagle Pup came on the scene, we'd looked at it and evaluated it some time beforehand, and it was too expensive, I think. But eventually, it looked like being an orphan in the country, so we bought it at a very satisfactory price. And it subsequently served the club very well, and it was a nice aeroplane to fly and popular aerobatic aeroplane. In '74, I think it was, I became club manager. Norm Gibson had left at that stage, and I applied for and was appointed club manager, which was something of a departure for me to become an administrator, principally an administrator, but I was still doing a couple of 100 hours flying and as well. I was the club manager until end of '81, '82. One of the first things I did, I remember, was to move the operations into the new clubhouse, which had been mostly underutilised, and we were able to make very much better use of that building. I think that was Cyril McAllister was president at that stage, and he was a great help in designing and organising the alterations to the building to make it all work. And that was great. It gave the club a new, slightly better image, because the old premises on the side of the hangar really had become a little bit run down. It gave people access to the club through a reasonably tidy clubhouse, rather than alongside a barbed wire fence within the hangar, which was not very attractive. Years when the club had reached quite a stable plateau of operation, and it had quite a lot of momentum. We had a good modern fleet. We were able to replace aircraft most years. We were able to buy new Cherokees and sell off old ones. Throughout most of that time we did lots of flying. 20,000 hours was a typical round figure each year. The club generally averaged about 1,500 members.